Here we go. All right, we are recording. So thank you everyone for joining with us. I'm glad that you're here for our fourth and our final presentation from Ann on making the invisible visible. Ann has done that so beautifully in the stories that she has told, the songs that she has sung, the questions that she's raised, and the conversations she's helped get started. I'm excited and looking forward to this, our final discussion. I want to remind you all, if you would like to share a comment or a question or add to the conversation, you can do so in the chat feature. And when you do that, I want to encourage you, if you're open to sharing it with everybody, to share that to panelists and to attendees. And maybe towards the end of the presentation, as we come to the end, I wonder if you might be willing to share with us one or two gifts that you have gained from these past 4 sessions. So you can share that now or wait till the very end to share a couple of the gifts that you have gained from these presentations. Maybe a conversation that this has raised for you, or a question that you hadn't thought about, or a story that you've never heard before. So I want to invite you to share that with one another and with those of us who are panelists for this. And towards the end, I'll share a couple other quick ideas about what happens next from here for us. But welcome. Let me open us with a word of prayer, and then I'll mute myself and I'll kind of sit back, and Ann is going to take the wheel. So will you join with me in a word of prayer? O Lord, on this Palm Sunday, we recall your triumphant entry into Jerusalem. The high spirits that were there that day, waving palm branches and laying down cloaks, looking forward to and anticipating a brighter future that would be ahead. O Lord, little did they know how challenging the days and the weeks would be before them. O Lord, how little did your church know how challenging the years and the generations would be ahead of them. We struggled to live as your people and to live into your kingdom in the world that is so often at odds with your words of love, of mercy, and of unity. God, give us your spirit of resilience, of faithfulness, as we turn our attention to you, our Lord. Open our eyes and our ears and our hearts during this presentation today. And Father, we pray for all those who've been adversely affected by tornadoes, by storms in these last few days. Send to them helpers who are full of mercy and kindness. We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen. Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to see you again on this last webinar that we have for this series. And I hope that I'll continue to hear from you. I'm receiving some emails trying to answer your questions that you have. And I appreciate all of you that have joined in for these last 3 sessions and for this one today. I wish you the very best. I always say, because this is the Methodist Church, I have an education because the Methodist Church had a school in Asheville, a boarding school for African-American girls that gave me a wonderful education and a lot of fantastic experiences in life. So for all, especially the older, very older people, elders of the community who provided some help for Allen High School back in those days, I'm very grateful. I just want to thank my friend Esther Manchester, who had the idea to do this. And thank you, Pastor Will Posey. Appreciate your being there for us and really making sure that this happened. Karen Crump, thank you. Sue Bell for your work. Catherine Jenkins, I'm sorry that she's going through all those problems with her mother and the family with the storms. I just want to say thank you. And then One Dozen Who Care is an organization that I founded, but they're founding members of it that set a good path for us to move on making the invisible visible. And why is it called invisible? It is because there's so few African Americans in far western North Carolina that we're about 1.6% of the population. And often people don't think there are any African Americans in this area. I guess we can call ourselves Afro-Latins. from from Frank X. Walker's work. So we're here, and we've been talking about what has happened with the African American people in the United States, in the state of North Carolina, and in our communities. And I always say that there are two sides to every story. And I want to make sure that we hear some of the stories and that we respond to those. So we're making the invisible visible, unfinished business. Karen, can you show the slide? This is learning from our history and leaning into to our future regarding race and reconciliation. And that's for our Western North Carolina folks. The first thing that I want to talk about is I have a favorite scripture that says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. That's Hebrews 11:1. And that is because we are sitting here now. We don't know what this is going to cause, what will happen behind what we're doing in these sessions that we're doing right now. But we have to have the hope that it's going to make a difference, and a positive, uplifting difference for our community. Information is one of the reasons that I'm doing these presentations, because knowledge is power, and I want to ask everybody to please use it for the good. Helen Keller said, the best and most beautiful things in the world cannot be seen or even touched. They must be felt by the heart. We've talked about that already. Your heart is so important in this. Love. This is also for outreach. I ask you to hold a conversation about race with somebody. It's imperative that you talk with somebody different from yourself. Next slide. Mother Teresa said, being unwanted, unloved, uncared for, forgotten by everybody, I think that is a much greater hunger, much greater poverty than the person who has nothing to eat. Being unloved. This is also for self-reflection. I would ask you to think about what you've done, what you're planning to do, and how you're going to work together to help remove the injustices that we all have to face. I did these presentations. It's not about making anybody feel guilty, but to inform you, the ones of you who care, to listen about this hidden history of people who surround you. You're all around these people, but you don't have to pay attention. If you're a white person in this region, you really don't have to pay much attention, but it's time for us to think and to care about each other. So this is why we call it making the invisible visible, and it's called unfinished business, because we have work to do. I wanted to show the people in Cherokee County that have been very kind and caring to me, very open-hearted. And I say that you can't lean on what somebody else has already done. You can't lean on what you've already done. We have to move forward and keep giving to make sure that we take down these walls that divide us, and to build bridges across the lines of race and religion, ethnic origin, whatever the groups are. We need to build bridges to make this a better country. Jean Bennett was the only person on a African-American person on a board when I became the county planner. And that was a shame, but she looked like a white woman. So it was something that had to change. And I don't know that it's changed even to this day. So Brenda Blunt has worked for the Cherokee County school system as bookkeeper and a systems manager. And I've been the county planner. And we need to reach out and make sure that there are other people of color that have opportunities to work in our county. The next slide, please. That next slide after that, I'll talk about that one. Humiliation, fear, and death for African Americans. There were laws called Jim Crow laws. State and local laws in the United States were enacted between 1876 and 1965. And they were by de jure the laws were de jure, which is by law, is what de jure means, and de facto can happen because people live in a cluster. But that kind of segregation took place, and it was planned well to keep African Americans from making it in this country after freedom. There were these groups called white caps, and I talked about how my grandfather came to Andrews because the white caps burned down their community in Forsyth County, Cumming, Georgia. The Knights of the Ku Klux Klan came after the white caps, and they're very dangerous, violent group that really is there to harm and to hurt people of color, different people of color, the Jews, Catholics even. Over the years, they have done some terrible violent acts on these people. Some of the events of our country have been erased from the historical records, and one of them is the Wilmington Massacre. It was a politically motivated attack by white supremacists against the Wilmington African American leadership in what they call the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. It showed how far white supremacists would go to regain political domination of the South after Reconstruction. Wilmington was a very progressive town down on the east coast of North Carolina, and it was actually the largest town in North Carolina in 1898. And it had people of color were in leadership positions. There were policemen, there were businesses, African Americans owned businesses. They had drugstores and barber shops and beauty shops, and there were policemen and firemen that were where Black people were working together for some time. And the plan of the people who decided that they were going to take over the government was to stop economic development for the Black people who were making it at that time. Next slide, please. Next slide.
Okay, give me one. It's not going. Hang on.
Okay, all right. I can keep talking about it though. After that, you can move on to the next one.
Okay, it's not wanting to go.
Well, see, continue to work on that, and I'll say that
There it goes.
Yes, okay. That's one of the slides, so you can move to the next one then. This is a racist cartoon that was in the Raleigh News and Observer on September the 27th of 1898. For 4 years, the government had been led by a multiracial group of leaders, and they were getting along very well and helping this community of Wilmington to grow. But there was a group of white Democrats that they were supremacists who planned an insurrection. They planned it in advance, and they announced their plan to the people that were going to follow them. And they decided to use the threat of lynching to intimidate Black men who they said, and they tried to scare the white women of Black men. So this is a cartoon that they used for that, and to actually have it in the major newspaper of the area, it breaks your heart when you think of things that happen like that. There was a white woman from Georgia who came and made a speech that supported lynching Black men for what she called improper relationships with white women. A Black newspaper man editor was there, and he wrote in his paper that white men were doing the same thing. They were as culpable for the unacceptable relationships as any Black man was. And the disagreement just grew to a fever pitch and caused a lot of racial friction. African-American voters turned out at that election in large numbers, but the white supremacists stuffed the ballot boxes, and so they won and overthrew the government that should have been in place at that time. After the violence of the massacre, it was a coup d'etat, and that coup d'etat, coup, is the only successful coup that has taken place in the United States. Next slide, please. There is a now on the square by the depot where all this crowd of supremacists gathered, there is a big plaque that stands there now that explains, it's a marker that talks about what happened over 120 years ago with the removal of the people that were in the government at that time. The supremacists gathered, went down to the newspaper man's place, broke out the windows and set a fire there. And because he was very light skinned, we talked about complexions. He was white skinned. He was a black man with white skin. He was able to escape by the fact that he had white skin. The bias in North Carolina was such that the newspapers wouldn't accept anything the black people told them. And so they said that the supremacists that had taken over the government said 25 blacks were killed and they were taking care of an uprising is the reason. They said it was a black racial uprising. And that's why that those 25 were killed. And it was said that probably 300 people were black people were killed and many thrown in the river. And they found proof of that later, much later. The event planted the seeds of efforts to limit African-American political power by increasing they increased voter restrictions for black people in North Carolina. They succeeded in removing all the African-Americans that had any kind of political participation or leadership in the city. And at least 2,000 black people left the community and never returned. The white leaders of the coup became the mayor and remained in his office until he died 7 years later. Next slide, please. You can look at this for yourself, but this is a list of other racial massacres in the United States. Over 20 massacres occurred in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And there's a little picture there that came out of a French newspaper called Le Petit Journal, which was a Republican and conservative newspaper in Paris that showed what happened to the black people who were beaten and murdered in the Atlanta riots, they called them. It was the Atlanta Massacre. So you can see that whole list right there, and that's not all. So how is it, I ask, that people expect black people to pick themselves up by their own bootstraps when every time they tried, they were murdered? Someone was hanged to make sure that everybody saw it, to make sure if you stepped out on your own that you were going to be punished. Next, please. The worst person that we could think of back in the 60s was George Wallace, who stood in he stood defiantly, stood in the door of University of Alabama and would not let the 4 students go in to the university, even though the president, the government had stated that that integration had to happen. At the bottom of the purple area there shows George Wallace in his wheelchair because a 21-year-old white busboy named Arthur Bremer shot him and paralyzed him, and he was paralyzed for life. Over to the bottom right, you will see George Wallace as an old man. He was a very handsome young politician who said, he's famous for saying segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever. That was his stance. And he did that for political gain. But you reap what you sow, and it's very evident here because you can see him down in the corner and you see the edge of a black man's face. That black man was Jimmy Dallas, and he was his valet until he died. A black man had to take care of him. Next, please. A friend of mine always says, I can't hear what you're saying for seeing what you're doing. So it means that a lot of people can be hypocrites. My daddy used to say, when you point your finger at somebody, 4 are pointing back to you. But what we want is love and forgiveness. And there's a statement from John Lewis that said the very essence of the civil rights movement was its appeal to the conscience of those who beat us with batons, attacked us with dogs, and stood defiantly at the schoolhouse door. But he said, when I met George Wallace, I had to forgive him, because to do otherwise, to hate him, would only perpetuate the evil system we sought to destroy. Shirley Chisholm was a Black woman who ran for president in the 60s, 70s, in early 70s. She had been the first Black woman elected to the Congress of the United States in New York's 12th congressional district, and she was there for 7 terms. She went to visit George Wallace in the hospital when he was shot, and she said, I just thought it was the right thing to do. And in the middle, you'll see a tearful Black woman accepting George Wallace's plea for forgiveness. He really was remorseful at the end of his life when he went to Black churches and apologized. He did a whole round of visits to the churches to say he was so sorry for how he had treated Black people. And when Shirley Chisholm lobbied for a bill to give domestic workers a right to the minimum wage, Wallace was the one who rallied Southern votes to help her out with that. Next, please. We talked about the Green Book, and I didn't get into it much earlier on, but Black people had a tough time traveling in the United States. And sometimes people in New York will say, you know, oh, I don't know anything about that segregation stuff because I live in New York. Well, I'm sorry, but New York was one of the worst places for returning on the Fugitive Slave Act. They would catch Black people that had escaped the South and the slavery and send them back. And of course, that meant life was really horrible for them. There was a man named Victor Green who was a postal worker and a community leader in Harlem, New York, and he wanted to make it safer for Black people to travel. And at first he put out his book called The Green Book, named after himself. It was called the Negro Motorist Green Book, an International Travel Guide, or the Green Book. It was known, it was published from 1936 to 1964 when the Civil Rights Act passed. Victor knew the stories of so many people who had traveled and found danger on the road. He started it out because there were segregated parts of New York City, and that's what he started out working on. He designed and sold his guidebook because the stories that were told about Black people being insulted, embarrassed, humiliated, and even jailed on trumped up charges while they were trying to tour the United States like any white person could do. It was at a time when they began to have more economic development and they could afford it, but they could not travel because of the dangers that awaited them. In the far western North Carolina area, North Georgia and East Tennessee, they weren't included in the Green Book because most people, unless they were from here, were afraid to come into these mountains. And so Jim Crow laws, the vestiges of Jim Crow laws were left, and that scared a lot of Black people from traveling in the area. The nearest city that is listed in the Green Book to us is Asheville, and it had several places for people to stay. Next, please. I'm just kind of giving an overview of some things that have happened. Next slide, please. When Jesse Owens, in 1936, when he went to Berlin and showed Hitler that people of color were just as good as, if not better than, his group that he put above everybody else, that he refused, but when he won his awards, when he won all of those 4 gold medals, Hitler said, do you think I would allow myself to be photographed shaking the hand of a Negro? And I'm sure he didn't just say Negro. They probably cleaned that up. But they put newspapers out. We weren't surprised at what happened with Hitler, because we know what his thinking was. But what really hurt was when Jesse Owens, after winning for the United States, after winning those awards for this country, when he returned, he and his wife could not find a hotel to stay in New York City. And then finally one stretched their, they really bent over backward to let them in a room if they promised to go in the back door. There's more about the Green Book that would tell you this is the kind of thing that was happening all over the United States for Black people. President Roosevelt didn't even bother to invite Jesse Owens to the White House, which was the usual custom. Next, please. Althea Gibson was a tennis player. She was the first Black tennis player to win the French Open, the Wimbledon, excuse me, and the U.S. Open singles championships. She was one who really seriously worked hard to show people that there should be no difference, but it was a closed area. When you think about tennis being a sport for people with money, it was mostly closed for her. But she opened up a pathway to people like the Williams sisters, Serena and Venus, and the one who just beat Serena Williams, Coco Gauff. These people may not even know what Althea had to go through. She was a great athlete, and she is also the first Black person to receive a card of the ladies. It's called the I always say it wrong, LPGA, which is the Ladies Professional Golf Association. And the lady Althea was inducted into 3 halls of fame: International Tennis Hall of Fame, the International Women's Sports Hall of Fame, and the National Women's Hall of Fame in 2002. And 2 autobiographies were written. With collaboration, she wrote 2 of her autobiographies. Next, please. Now, the next person is Wilma Rudolph. Wilma Glodine Rudolph was an African-American sprinter who became a world record-holding Olympic champion and international sports icon in track and field in the 1956 and in 1960 Olympic Games. Wilma was born into a family of 21 kids. She was crippled. She was a very handicapped child, but her mother and her sisters and brothers all supported her through it. And she decided she made a difference. She decided that she was not going to just sit there and wear her crutches, braces, and corrective shoes the rest of her life. So you can see her running in these pictures. After her Rome Olympics triumphs, she came back home to Clarksville, Tennessee, and they were going to have a parade for her. And they always had separate parades, Black and white parades. But she insisted that she would not be there and that they would have to integrate the parade and then the banquet afterward. So she stood up and used her privilege to make a difference. Next, please. These young people have led the way for other young people to fulfill their dreams. These athletes in the 2018 Winter Olympics in South Korea were 17-year-old Mamie Biney, who was the first Black woman to be part of the U.S. Olympic speed skating team. Erin Jackson was the first Black woman on the Team USA's Olympic speed skating team, and Jordan Greenway was the first African-American player to compete on the U.S. Olympic men's hockey team. So we can be proud of these young people and encourage our young people in our areas to please get out and follow your dream. That's what One Doesn't Who Care was all about, was to try to encourage, when we started, was to try to encourage young people to get busy making a difference, choosing a dream and following it. Next, please. I have said to you that there is such a thing as white privilege. It exists, and there's no need in denying it. You have it if you're white, so use it. Make use of it. Decide that you're going to take your privilege and make perfect use of helping to bring down these very horrible injustices that are happening in the country. And I know that there's so many that have used it. That's why we have less injustice than we have had. Equality, injustice, inequality, injustice, intolerance, and racism need to be wiped off the face of the United States. So let's don't pretend that we don't have privilege. I have the education privilege, as I've told you before. I have the privilege of coming from a family that was well respected. From my grandfather, who came to Andrews and bought the first house, built the first house in Happy Top that became the Black community, when he and his family were chased out of Cumming, Georgia in Forsyth County in 1912. Next, please. There's a writer who wrote The 7 Habits of Highly Effective People that I read a long time ago, and I'm really glad that I did. I loved reading motivational works and trying to do the best that I can to be a leader and to be someone who respects people around me and receives respect myself. So he said, seek first to understand, then to be understood. So you're listening. And I've said this over and over. Listen to people, talk to people, have conversations. He said, most people don't listen with the intent to understand. They listen with the intent to reply. This is a painting that I did in the middle, and a billboard has gone up in Murphy and in Andrews that talks about looking at us. We're not invisible. African-American people live here, work here, have helped to build this community. And when you think about the slaves that were here that helped to build and clear land and make it possible for us to have our towns and our regions, see me, look at me. Don't look past me. Don't say, I don't see color. That begins to disturb me somewhat when someone says to me at this late stage, I don't see color. We all see color. Well, not all. Some people are colorblind, I guess. But we see color when we're looking at people. I have actually seen people at the post office who've always been friendly with me, and I have my mask on and they want to know who I am, or they look at me and won't speak when I speak because they see only the color. That's all they're looking at. So my artwork is being displayed and supported on billboards by ABIPA of Asheville and the interdisciplinary research leaders with a grant from the Robert Woods Johnson Foundation and friends that I don't have permission to say who they are at this time, who are supportive of having these billboards. And there will be 5 billboards in Asheville over 5 months, 5 times it will be shown. And we will have discussions. That hashtag See Me, Western North Carolina, or WNC, should take us to websites that are important to understand each other better. Next, please. The Methodist Church chose to speak out and say racism is a sin. And the United Methodists are to stand against racism. That's a promise they have made. And they say that we commit to challenging unjust systems of power and access. We will work for equal and equitable opportunities in employment and promotion, education and training, in voting access to public accommodations and housing, to credit loans, venture capital and insurance, to composite leadership, and power in all elements of our life together, and to full participation in the church and the society. So I thank you for having me here. The Methodist Church, the First Methodist Church of Murphy, invited me to come, and it did surprise me a little bit that they asked me to do 4 sessions, but I'm really grateful that I had this opportunity. So the next slide, please. It asks you, what can you do in this time of chaos in our beloved country? Some people I talked about before have shown what they could do, even in a time when segregation was hot and heavy in Andrews. These people that are listed here have been wonderful to support me and my family and other people around me, other African Americans. So I ask that you pledge to take a stand, decide that you are going to make a difference in people's lives. Choose to try to understand each other. Next, please. So I was asked in the beginning if I had some suggestions of what I think could help our communities. And the goal was to create a prototype, in my opinion, of love and understanding in our communities. And some of the things that I would suggest, and there would be people with a whole lot more background and education in all of this than I, and clergy, Pastor Will, but Blacks are usually left out of the conversations because there are so few of us. And so we seem to be invisible. Some people in both communities are afraid to wake up the Black community, which is a sleeping giant. The internet has made it so that if a person can't even read and write that well, they can see and hear what is going on in this country. And we want to work to make this a peaceable country, one where we can get along together, where people that pray will pray, but put some feet on your prayers, as the old African proverb was. Don't just pray and expect things to happen without getting out and doing something about it. You can start to hold storytelling sessions where people are telling their positive and their negative stories. A task force or a committee at the high schools to get the youth opinions. Dana Patterson is the new NAACP president, and I would ask her if she would speak to us if we needed that. I'd like to hear her opinion and opinions of the people she's working with about the monuments and the sites that we have in this region. I'd like to see us hold a summit that involves Black preachers in our region. All the ones that are in this region right here in this area are Baptist, but there should be no divide between Baptist, Methodist, whoever else there would be. We should be able to work together to see what we can do to make our counties and our region better. And I'd like to see us reach out and get the mayors of the towns, Rick Ramsey and James Reed, to be a part of it, the sheriff and the police chiefs to speak at the summit, to get together and to seriously follow through on whatever it is that they say they will do. And the last slide is the one that I always show, and that is that love never fails. Do everything you can in love. We're going to make this invisible visible, people, as well as the acts that have gone on around us. The greatest of these is love. And I just want to say how much I appreciate all of you for being with me. And I'm ready if Will has the people's questions to answer and do the best that I can to answer your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ann. That was just wonderful. You said you're surprised that we did 4 sessions. Yeah, I'm realizing we could have done like 8 and still hardly scratched the surface. I'm hearing from one person, at least in the chat, that they're having trouble or can't hear you. I'm able to hear you, Ann. I'm not quite sure what we might be able to do about that. Your sound is coming through. We'll make this recording available, and that will be sent out to everybody. So hopefully, if we can't correct whatever's going on, that will be able to get this to you. So I have two questions I wanted to share with you, Ann, that I've gotten from people. One that just came through is explaining the one drop rule. You mentioned the one drop rule in a previous session. I wonder if you could explain what that means and why and how it mattered for people.
It mattered because there was a time with those Jim Crow laws where a Black person could be fishing on a bank, and a white person could come on the other side of the place, whatever, the pond or the river, and that Black person would have to pull his line out of the water because these Jim Crow laws were such that Black people were just pushed into a corner. If a person was known to have grandparents, great-grandparents that were Black, they were considered Black. And that's why they call it the one drop rule. One drop of Black blood made you Black. Is that's okay?
That's it. One drop of blood from a Black ancestor made you Black.
Yes.
As opposed to one drop of white blood did not have the same effect.
And so we have to think about how we look at this. Beethoven was Black. There are so many people there. They joke, and I can't remember his name. Hamilton, maybe. One of the presidents had Black grandparents, great grandparents, and so when they said President Obama was the first Black president, they said, "Oh no, we've had one before that, at least one." So that one drop rule made it very difficult.
Wow.
A lot of Black people did what is called passing. If their skin was very white, they could pass as white, and they would escape sometimes the South or wherever they lived, and they would become white people. And most of the women would not have children because they knew that their child could come out looking dark. And recently we heard the Oprah Winfrey interview with Meghan Markle and the Prince Harry, and how someone from over there asked, how dark is this child going to be?
I remember
and that was that same thing about the one drop rule.
That's what a great kind of current event to kind of bring that home, and then the high stakes involved. Thank you.
Yeah.
Here's another question somebody raised. That this expresses a question I've heard from a couple of people. Why is it okay for a white person to use the expression Black Lives Matter, but maybe not to refer to an African American person as Black or an Afro-Latin, as you said? So please tell us, this is a person saying, please tell us more about the current preferred and historically offensive terms, i.e. Black, Brown, Negro, African American, person of color. How you choose the most honorable terms for our today's changing world. So maybe one way to say that is, what are the words that white folks are supposed to use these days?
I am not going to sit here and tell you that I speak for all Black people or all African Americans or any names that they would want to be called. I know that I don't want anyone to use the term nigger, darky, spook, porch monkey. None of those kinds of terms are going to be acceptable to anybody. And they were used on us. I told last week about my little sister, who was such a beautiful little baby child, and Daddy would take her downtown to a store. And the old lady that was sitting there, because her son was taking care of her in his store, she would see Nina come in, and oh, she would just have a fit. Oh, look at this beautiful little darky. And it upset Nina greatly, but Daddy would try to laugh about it because it's a funny sounding name, a darky. But that lady loved Nina. She would take her through the store and give her gifts and all kinds of things. So it was just a matter of someone needed to straighten her out and tell her that was an offensive name. Black is not an insult. It used to be, but it depends. If you call somebody Black as a negative name, of course it's going to be offensive. I had my dear friend, I won't name her right now, but she used to say colored. And I heard her say it, and there were other people around, so I didn't say anything to her. One day she said colored, and she said, oh, colored people, whatever. And I said, you must stop, because one day you're going to have people who visit here from somewhere else, and they will be highly insulted just because my dad and my aunt use that term from time to time. Doesn't mean that it's acceptable for you as a white person to call someone colored. That is such an old-fashioned, old-time name that all a person has to do is use their education, listen to what the newspapers write. I mean, read what the newspapers write, listen to what the newsmakers say, and you're pretty safe, because they have to make sure that they are politically correct as one thing, but just caring. And ask your friend. If you have a friend, ask. I'll have one other story real quick. I had a cousin who said Polak one day, and we were standing at the Vietnam Memorial, and she said Polak, and she said it more than once. And I said, why are you saying Polak? I said, that's an offensive name. She said, no, it's not. I have a Polak friend, and we love each other. We've been friends for all these years. I said, well, why don't you do me a favor? Don't be angry with me for saying this, but would you call your friend and ask him? She did. And when she did, he told her that it was offensive and that he loved her and he knew she loved him. And so he didn't get insulted because she used that terminology.
Can I just say, one of the things that the gifts that you have given to me, Ann, and challenged me on is the way that you continually pushed us to say, why don't you just go talk to somebody and ask the person that you know the question?
Yes.
Or to just, in love, speak to your family member or your friend and say, that really isn't an appropriate or loving thing to say. If we, to use the phrase that I heard as a kid, like nip it in the bud,
Yeah.
or if you name it,
Mm-hmm.
and people realize, oh, ouch,
Mm-hmm.
I didn't realize that, or it changes or corrects something that's inside of us. So thank you for the next steps. Things are not social media activism as much as it is a phone call or a conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. As you're talking about terms, you used previously terms like uncle and aunt were pejorative or diminutive used toward Black folks, or even to call someone like boy, which I still hear people say, which makes me think of, I think Aunt Jemima is changing its label. So is Uncle Ben's rice. Both of those are being changed right now.
There is something that I have a funny story. My sister, who passed away, and her husband and my husband at the time went with my dad to a farm to butcher some hogs. And the white man there said, "You boys, would you do this thing over here like this?"
Yes.
And I remember that my husband was furious. He grew up in Ohio, and he was just red-faced behind it. He could not stand the idea of being called a boy. But my sister's husband grew up in Asheville, and he knew that in the South, boy is a term that can be used across the lines of race. Now, if someone is insulting a Black man, and he is an educated stand-up, doesn't even have to be educated, just for respect. If they insult that person, you can tell when you're being insulted or when it's just being called out.
Yeah. Perhaps even rather than referring to someone as a Black or a white person, we call them by name, right?
Yeah, thank you. That works.
Here are two questions. So I'll just go ahead and give you both of them. I think I can answer the second one. How do we use white privilege in ways that are not demeaning or insulting to people of color? And then the second question is, are our local Black pastors members of the Cherokee County Ministerial Alliance?
Now, I don't know that because I'm not a minister, so I don't see who's there. I have asked my pastors in the past to join that alliance. The question about how can white people use white privilege is using it with your own people. It's not necessarily using it with Black people. It's using it to stand up against racism and injustice. But you do it with your own people. That is going to take white people working with white people speaking to white people. And, you know, people say, well, you know, I heard my uncle say that at the Thanksgiving table or something. Well, you don't have to insult that person right at the table, but you should find a time and a place where you can have a discussion with them and want to know why are they telling these Black jokes or speaking against Black people. And it's not as if I'm trying to tell you that Black people don't do crimes and don't do things wrong. That's not the point. And I'm not saying go out and just reach out to any Black person and do whatever you have to do with them. You have to use wisdom. But for the whole group of African Americans, you can watch television and see what's happened. But also always have hope, because I see so much changing. When I was a kid, you never would have seen a Black person brushing their teeth on television. You never would have seen them using deodorant. And so here's the whole thing. We were using deodorant. We were brushing our teeth. We were using hair products on our hair, but we were left out. It was almost like, you know, who are you? And when I had a business and I went down to Macy's in Atlanta to sell my products, in Atlanta, the buyer there told me Black people don't buy anything in here. And I couldn't believe it. I almost fainted because I just passed by all these Black people shopping in his store, right? But he didn't want my Black products to be sold in his store. That is a pity.
Wow. Again, this is one of those where you're reminding and pushing us. Use your white privilege within your people, your family, your friendship circles, your community, to have the hard conversations. Yeah, Janelle just underscored the need for courage to utilize white privilege effectively requires courage. Thank you, Janelle.
Yes, and you spoke of that not too long ago in one of your sermons about courage. Your heart might be beating fast and you might be shaking at your knees, but you've got to have courage. Thank you.
That's absolutely right.
Thanks, Janelle.
There was a question about our local Black pastors part of the ministerial association. I don't think so, but I think some of that perhaps is the pastor at Mount Zion in Texana. I don't believe lives in Murphy. I can't recall his name at the exact moment.
Reverend John P. Webb.
Yes, he preached at one of our Lenten services last year that we held at First Methodist. Brother Turner at Mount Zion in Andrews does live in the area. Is bivocational. It's hard to make the meetings that we have when they happen. He was going to be our preacher this Good Friday, but was unable because of a conflict that emerged at the kind of last minute. But hopefully we might find ways for several of our congregations to do more together, to be in fellowship and ministry. I think that would be a good and beautiful thing.
Yes.
Any other questions that you all want to raise in the chat? Would love to hear from you in here. A lot of people are sharing kind of gifts that they have gained from you, including, or most especially, a much greater knowledge and awareness and of stories that you told about what race has looked like in far western North Carolina. Fascinating to me that our area wasn't even included in the Green Book because people just knew, why would I travel? Why would I travel through someplace like that? You're telling the story of the Wilmington Massacre. Had a very good friend who was a history major, North Carolina history major at Chapel Hill. Never knew that story. Never learned it until he read Tim Tyson's book, Blood Done Sign My Name. Tim Tyson, the son of a Methodist preacher in the eastern part of the state. Highly recommend that for anyone looking for a brief history of race in North Carolina. Any other questions from folks that you want to raise while we have some time together?
I want to do one thing.
Yeah.
I've had several people ask me to sing a song. So
Oh, yes, please.
I'm going to try to sing a song. One day I was sitting with my mother and I asked her some questions that sort of like, it was sort of like, you know, what kind of hope do you have? And she sang this spiritual. I sometimes think that we need to sing together. That would be another great way to tear down some of these walls that divide us, is just sing together, because Dr. Craddock from down at Cherry Log, Georgia, said if you hear a white group singing "Pass Me Not, O Gentle Savior," they say, "Pass me not, O gentle Savior, hear my humble cry." But a black person singing it in a black church says, "Pass me not, O gentle Savior." And they sing it slowly with meaning that's deep down inside. And they're not just singing notes, because a lot of times when I was growing up, there were no hymn books whatsoever. People just learned how to sing. But I asked my mother one day to sing, and she said her hope is in, "There is a land of fadeless day, free from all horror, pain or care. And they tell me that there's no night over there. It's just over the hill." So I believe I'm going to meet my mama over the hill. That's it. That's it.
There ain't no night.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow. And I love what you said. We need to sing together. I think I heard someone say, quote, maybe, I think it was Ella Baker that they quoted, that said, "People who can sing together are people who can work together."
Thank you. That's a good one.
So someone just raised this question that I think is a great one. We talked about some terminology. You've talked about white privilege some, and racism as a sin, and a phrase that is new to me as well is anti-racism. I wonder if you might be able to describe, what do we mean? What is meant by anti-racism? What does that look like?
As I said before, I can't speak for all African American people. I'm speaking for myself. It means the opposite of racism. It means that if I have some friends right now in Andrews who did not understand a lot of things that were happening, but they were willing to stop and listen to what I had to say about it. And sometimes they've changed their stance, I guess you would say. They understood more, and they've decided that they want to hear what we're saying, and, like, you know, understanding rather than waiting to respond, period. So anti-racism to me just means that you're not going to be a racist, out and out racist. That's it for me.
I thank you for that. Yeah, I heard, I listened to Ibram Kendi X, who wrote a book on becoming anti-racist. He did a podcast interview with Brene Brown. It was very meaningful and helpful to me. And he talked about anti-racism. And I'll check this with you, Ann, and you can tell me your thoughts here. He said, to say that I'm not racist doesn't really say a whole lot. It just creates kind of like a vacuum. But to be anti-racist is a way of saying, not only do I think this is bad, but I believe I think it is bad enough that I'm going to commit to being a part of a solution here. Like, I'm going to do something. So to say not racist doesn't say anything really, If it says anything, it says what the Desmond Tutu quote was, and that is to try to almost be neutral, and to choose neutrality is to choose the side of the oppressor. I believe is what the quote said. So to be anti-racist is to declare, in our baptismal terminology as United Methodists, we say that we promise to resist, which is an active, it's a verb, to resist evil, injustice, and oppression in whatever forms they present themselves. So racism is not as overt and open, perhaps, as it once was. It is in a lot of cases, but it's also subtle. It pops up in ways that are subtle and systemic, and maybe harder to tease out. And
there are many. Excuse me. Go ahead.
No, I was just Ken Ibram. One of the things that he said was, anti-racism begins with confession, which you said you listed self-reflection as a critical next step for everybody, is self-reflection. And I have found that to be true for my own self. When I have to tell stories of my own kind of racial history, it's usually a confessional story, of confessing how I have thought, how I have let people see what I think based on what I do. And it's been a growing process. How does that jive or like connect to kind of your?
Well, it's like you see it. You can see it. I mean, you can see that happening around you. And if you decide you're going to put that way back on the back shelf, that's the problem that we have right now, is people are looking at racism all the time. I mean, Chauvin is on trial right now, or his jury is being chosen, and I'm not sure, I haven't listened the last few days, for killing George Floyd. He had his sunglasses on his head, his knee on the man's neck. You can see the man urinated on himself. He was in pain. He was begging his dead mother. He was dying right there. And the man was like, this is just a piece of wood that I'm on. This is not a human being. You wouldn't do a dog that way. And so we have to stop this thing where we see it, but we don't acknowledge it. That's the biggest thing. And acknowledging it is, to me, is one of the most important things. You can see sometimes your own thing that you're doing, and stop and think about it and see how you can fix it.
That helps me. So that connects to something else that you said when I think about anti-racism. It is to say I'm not a racist. Doesn't claim like a broader responsibility. So you hear, like you said, your friend who talked about a Pollock, or who uses who calls somebody colored or a darkie. You hear that and you say, I didn't say that. I'm not a racist. An anti-racist response would have been what you did, which was to say, have you considered calling your friend and checking in with them about what that means to them? So that anti-racist I think that maybe is right. That anti-racist movement would be to have the conversation, as so many people have been saying, and to move it in a positive direction rather than just let it slide.
Yes.
I think that.
Yes, I think you said it perfectly.
Now I just gotta do it.
That's the thing. We have to act.
Calls for courage.
Feet on those prayers now.
Put feet on the prayers, calls for courage, does it not, Janelle? Thank God we have a community who are, at least here present today and around us as well. Well, friends, we're a little over our time together. I don't want to hold you longer, or Ann. I don't see any other questions that have come in here at the end. If you have one, you need to fire it right this hot second. Otherwise, I hope that you'll join with me in expressing deep gratitude for Ann for leading these conversations. I learned a ton. I learned a lot of stories that I did not know. And you've given me a lot of, I call them like rabbit trails to kind of chase down and stories to pursue and to learn more about. And so I'm deeply grateful for that.
Thank you.
Everyone who is on here and those who are not, if anyone who has signed up for these webinars can expect to receive an email from us in the not so distant future. That email will invite some feedback on your experience of these presentations, as well as your desire for future and for further conversation and action. What are the conversations these have raised for you? Is there a conversation you want to pick up and see keep going? Is there action that you have heard that needs to keep moving? Ann raised several for us in a previous slide, inviting Black folks to conversations that we're having around the table in our area and in wherever you live. Having some meaningful conversation about monuments and sites of significance. Earlier, we were talking about burial grounds near the new school, even at the Harshaw Chapel. How can pastors in our area take a lead? What can young people be doing as a group in our area? All of these are great ideas for action. They require feet. Mostly they require heart.
Amen.
So thank you all so much. I want to invite you again to join me as with offering a word of thanks and deep gratitude to Ann for all of the time that she has given to this, and the heart, the knowledge, the experience, the music, and the hope that she has shared with us. Ann, I want to ask if you would share any last words that you would like to, and then either I'll close us in prayer, or if you want to close us in song. I'm putting you on the spot. You're welcome to do that. If not, I'd be delighted to close us in prayer, but I just want to give you space to share any last words.
I love to hear your prayers, but I just want us to love each other. That's the big thing. And love is not just some word. It means that you really deeply care, that you're thoughtful, that you care about what's going on. And yes, I will sing a little bit of a song.
Thank you.
Remember me. Remember me. Oh Lord, remember me. And I thank all of you. God be with you.
Amen. Thank you.